So what was going on in the rest of North Africa? Pretty much apart from Libya, all of it will end up becoming part of the French colonial empire. So after Algeria, probably next to go is going to be Tunisia. To make a long story short, eventually, as in Algeria, there's going to be a kind of growing resentment of French colonial rule, leading to political activism. In the case of Tunisia, you're going to see the development of what's known as the Destour Party, in full al-Hizb al-Hor al-Destouri al-Tunusi, literally the liberal constitutional party of Tunisia. And so the Destour Party really became active in the 1920s and 30s. And this is, also a major aspect of kind of the growth of Tunisian nationalism, right? Kind of arousing a Tunisian national consciousness in opposition to the French colonial rule. It's actually known as a protectorate, a lovely colonial term, right? The idea that the European power is there somehow to protect you, whether you want it or not. The Destour Party would eventually become the Neo-Destour Party in 1934. And initially, they're kind of really promoting more, greater autonomy or a greater political role, even if under French rule, but eventually demanding Tunisian independence, which will come in 1956 under the leadership of Habib Bourguiba, who will become Tunisia's first president. And at that point, the Neo-Destour Party becomes the Constitutional Democratic Rally. Basically, it's going to be a kind of single-party political system under their control. And so they're very secular, but we should note almost immediately it's going to be a very, very repressive regime, one of the most repressive regimes in the world. That will continue after Bourguiba. He's succeeded by Zine El Abidine Ben Ali in 1987 after Bourguiba is declared medically unfit to rule. Unfortunately for Tunisians, his regime proves to be as corrupt and repressive as his predecessor. He would rule until January 2011, at which point he would have to flee the country due to popular unrest. And that actually brings us to the Tunisian Revolution, which will also be kind of the first stage of what's known as the Arab Spring. Right? Probably most of you have heard of the Arab Spring. So developments in Tunisia will eventually influence developments in other parts of the region, including in the Middle East as a whole. Right? So what happened in Tunisia? Well, what a lot of people don't know is that the kind of political activism that took place during the Arab Spring had actually been going on for quite a while. And in many countries, not just Tunisia, it was driven primarily by labor unions. So it wasn't just about kind of political issues like corruption and a lack of political freedoms, but also economic issues like high unemployment, inflation, and just kind of all around poor living conditions, right? And so what happened is, right, these demonstrations just started becoming bigger and bigger, and the level of discontent just kept growing and growing, such that a single event could spark something on a much grander scale. In the case of Tunisia, that single event was the death of Mohamed Bouazizi, a 26-year-old Tunisian street vendor who at some point, right, I mean, had been harassed to such a great extent by the police, by the bureaucracy in terms of, getting proper licenses and so forth. Was really just finding it difficult to make a living and became so frustrated that he set himself on fire on December 17th in 2010 in protest. The immediate thing that had happened that set this off was the police had confiscated his wares. But, literally the straw that broke his back, and then that event was the thing that set off mass demonstrations that led to the Arab Spring, right? So, and that eventually would prove a catalyst for this kind of development throughout the region. In the case of Tunisia, almost immediately it compelled Zine El Abidine Ben Ali to step down after 23 years in power. And, initially the government's like, hopefully that will be sufficient, but it was pretty clear that the protesters demanded a great deal more. They wanted, first of all, the ruling party completely banned. They wanted all its members evicted from any future government, right? So initially there's going to be a transitional government, but as often happens in that case, the people who have been in power for ages try to, somehow still be in charge of the transitional government so they can control the outcome. Tunisia's like, no, no, we don't want any of you in this transitional government. And in the end, they got their way. The new government eventually conceded. And so here we see, these kind of massive protests taking place in Tunisia, but this became like kind of a common, almost daily event. And eventually, elections are held for a new government, for a constituent assembly on October 23rd, 2011. And we should note that Tunisia, even until now, has been something of a success story, right? I mean, it's still kind of a story that's evolving. Uh, but, like for instance, in Egypt, eventually the military is going to seize control, and now we have a military dictatorship. So, kind of a feeling that the Arab Spring ultimately failed, though, might I point out, the story is not over there yet either. And in other countries, governments like in Saudi Arabia and most of the Arabian countries will manage to hold on and maintain control. But in the case of Tunisia, things have been going in a, you know, granted, rather fitful but positive direction. One factor here was that you did have kind of an Islamic component politically. The Ennahda movement, which earlier had been banned under Ben Ali's regime. And so there's a bit of a question mark early on whether they're willing to cooperate with more secular parties. They kind of indicate that they would prefer, a kind of new government based on Islamic principles and so forth. So they're kind of an Islamic fundamentalist party, but from an early point, they make it clear that they would have preferred Sharia as the main source of legislation, but they're willing to accept that that won't be the case, and to maintain the secular nature of the party, and in a sense, just become one more political party that's competing for seats in the legislature, but also agreeing that it won't be a case that if they do get into power that they're going to try and undermine the whole system. So it's also kind of interesting to consider this as, suggesting there's a possibility for bringing Islamic fundamentalist group into the political fold in other countries, that they could become part of a proper kind of political process, whereas you have to cooperate with other parties, many of whom might not agree with you on religious principle and so forth. So let us also look at Morocco, which would be the last country in North Africa to fall under French colonial rule. Now, you might remember we mentioned that the Alawite dynasty has been ruling up until the present, and so this will continue even under European rule, albeit where they, basically have to take their cue from the French. But Morocco actually, up until the beginning of the 20th century, was still independent. I mean, by then, European powers had become increasingly involved in Morocco's internal affairs, particularly the French. And coming into the, towards the, in the period just before the First World War, the beginning of the 20th century, there was kind of a growing recognition that eventually Morocco would fall within the French sphere of influence, kind of polite way of saying it would become a French colony. The story behind how that happened is actually quite interesting. So around 1905, it really just seemed that, it was only a matter of, weeks even before Morocco became a French colony, when all of a sudden the head of the Second German Empire, Kaiser Wilhelm II, decided to pay the city of Tangiers in the north of Morocco a visit, where he made a speech in favor of Moroccan independence. And the Moroccans were quite happy to have that kind of support, but it did raise a lot of eyebrows in Europe. And this was understood as basically being a challenge to the French colonial presence there. And this has become like they call this the first Moroccan crisis, which obviously indicates there's going to be another one. Because this really did have the possibility of bringing about a war in Europe. The French were obviously quite upset. There's been a lot of speculation as to why the Kaiser did this. Supposedly, he was so convinced that the French and the British were, such colonial rivals that this would push the British closer to Germany against the French. But in fact, the French had already cleared their ambitions in Morocco with the British, and the British had indicated, we don't really have any interest there, go for it. And much to the surprise of Germany, the British came out in support of the French. And in fact, pretty much the entire international community came out in support of the French, something evident at a conference organized to settle the dispute in Algeciras in the south of Spain, where pretty much all the countries participating indicated their support for France. So a bit of a humiliation for the Kaiser, but it was kind of agreed to put off, French seizure of Morocco, at least for the time being. In the resulting agreement, this was signed in May of 1906. So the French basically relinquished, at least temporarily, some of its claims with respect to Morocco, just to help the Kaiser save face. Well, after a few years had passed, it became clear that the French were, really getting ready to move into Morocco. And right before that could happen, all of a sudden, a German gunboat appeared off the coast of Agadir, a city in the south of Morocco. This is what we call gunboat diplomacy, right? They weren't there for a spot of fishing. It was basically to send a message to the French. And so at this point, the Germans indicate that, fine, we'll accept French control of Morocco, but we demand compensation for what we lose as a consequence of that. And pretty much everyone, not just the French, but the international community as a whole, were like, what interests are you talking about that you might be relinquishing? You have no interest in Morocco. You're not active there politically, economically, pretty much in any way. You're not losing anything by the French going in there. But the Germans insisted. Eventually, another conference was held, leading to a convention that was signed in November of 1911, under which Germany accepted France's position in Morocco in return for territory in other parts of Africa. So thus ended the Second Moroccan Crisis. If this were a European history course, we'd be talking about how both of these are just going to push the French and the British closer together to effectively form a kind of military defensive alliance against Germany. As far as North Africa is concerned, the ultimate consequence of this was that Morocco became a French protectorate with the Treaty of Fez signed in March of 1912. Again, the term protectorate, really just a nice way of saying colony. So Morocco, the last North African territory to fall under colonial rule, right? Having been independent up until then. I didn't mention, kind of just an interesting fun fact, Morocco was the first country in the world to recognize the United States after it became independent following the American War of Independence. So eventually Morocco will rebel against French rule, much as we've seen in other parts of North Africa and Tunisia. The hero of Moroccan independence will actually be the Sultan, Sultan Muhammad V, right? So the Alawites are still in place, the kind of sultanate that they had established, even if you have kind of this overarching French rule. And Muhammad V becomes kind of the face or spokesperson of the movement for Moroccan independence. In fact, he's so popular that in 1953 the French exiled him to Madagascar and replaced him with a very unpopular fellow, Mohammed Ben Arafa. I don't know what the French thought would happen, but this led to massive demonstrations, right? Active opposition throughout the country. In connection with this, we also see the emergence of a political movement, the Istiqlal Party or Independence Party, and eventually Morocco wins its independence. France allows Mohammed V to return in 1955, after which they negotiate, Morocco's independence. So the transition to independence in this case is going to go relatively smoothly. Unfortunately, that's not going to be the case in Algeria, where the French have a much greater stake, in part because of the colons, right? I mean, the colons do not want to see the French leave. They're dependent on them to maintain their position, their superior political and economic position. In fact, even to protect their lives, it's not sure what would happen to them if the French military left. And the colons have tremendous political influence in the government. And also, during this period you have kind of decolonization taking place across the globe, it would be kind of humiliating for France to give up its most important colony. Nonetheless, by the Second World War and the period shortly after, you have a pretty strong movement of independence being headed up by a group called the Front de Libération Nationale. And they're like, look, we're not saying that we have to have complete independence, but we want greater autonomy. And then later on, the French actually begin considering literally absorbing Algeria into France proper, where it would actually become a part of France. And there are even some among the Algerian Muslim population who are like, that's fine if we're given full rights as French citizens. And of course, the French had no intention of doing that. Um, so, I mean, they are willing to compromise to some degree, but eventually it becomes clear that really the only possible solution, I mean, from an Algerian point of view, is independence, right? The French have no intention of somehow granting them full rights, either as kind of a semi-autonomous Algeria, or if in the event that Algeria became part of France. And this is going to lead to war, the Algerian War of Independence. Things really come to a head in 1954. Initially, it's kind of more between the indigenous Muslim population and the French settler population. You kind of get into this kind of tit-for-tat violence going back and forth. And eventually that's going to lead to outright war involving the French military. And the war doesn't conclude until 1962 with the death of hundreds of thousands of Algerians. And really only after it becomes entirely clear to the French that the Algerian indigenous population will not accept continued French rule. So at that point, Algeria gains complete independence following the Evian agreements and a self-determination referendum in July. So here we see a scene from kind of the early days where it's mostly about protests and demonstrations around 1954, eventually escalating into the War of Independence. Related to this, I just wanted to also recommend, if you get a chance, you should see a film called The Battle of Algiers. It's not a documentary, it's a proper film, but very historically accurate about this particular period leading up to the War of Independence by an Italian director. And so first of all, I mean, it's just, a beautiful, very entertaining film. Second of all, you really learn a lot about kind of what was going on at the time. And third of all, I think it really conveys in a very nice way this kind of tit-for-tat aspect to conflict. When I was watching it, I thought a lot about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? And it's like a similar dynamic that ends up evolving. And just one other kind of interesting aside, most of the Algerian characters not played by professional actors, but people that the director actually brought off the street. And they're just fantastic. I mean, I was quite surprised to learn they weren't professional. Most of the French characters played by professional actors. So again, if you get a chance to see the Battle of Algiers, I highly recommend it. A big question is going to be what happens to the colons. Most of them are going to go to France. I should say back to France, but consider that many of these colons were already second, third, fourth generation colons, right? So, most of them spoke French, had probably been to France, but they didn't really view France as their home. It wasn't this feeling of going back, right? So about 900,000 French Algerians are going to migrate to France between 1962 1964. Also a large number of these Evolus, these Algerians who had adopted French culture, who don't really feel there's a place for them within Algeria. Well, the leader of the resistance organization of the Front de Libération Nationale, or FLN, was kind of the hero of Algerian independence, seen as the father of the nation, and he will become Algeria's first president. His name, Ahmed Ben Bella. And he turns out to be not particularly effective as a president. He's overthrown a few years later in 1965 by his former ally and defense minister, Houari Boumédiène. And Houari Boumédiène will actually rule, and here we see the same story that we saw in Tunisia, pretty much as an authoritarian. It does try to develop the economy along socialistic lines on the basis of Algeria's oil resources, which are plentiful. These are nationalized. But, I mean, he's not a big fan of political freedom. His successor, Chadli Bendjedid, also somewhat of an authoritarian, though he's going to move away from more socialistic policies to liberal economic ones. even while trying to promote the Arabization and Islamization of Algerian society and public life, hoping in this way to perhaps um, achieve greater support. But that isn't going to work out. Particularly, a lot of the liberal economic reforms are actually going to uh, really be quite harmful to large numbers of Algerians who end up being very poor. So Chadli Bendjedid, he's president up until 1992. He had actually been the Minister of Defense prior to that. So he became president because Houari Boumédiène had actually died. Um, so again, right, he tried to, in a sense, he's kind of authoritarian, but he did try to reduce the state's role in the economy and to ease some government surveillance of citizens. But this really was a case of, too little, too late. And again, a lot of the economic reforms actually proved harmful to many Algerians. And so there were quite a few who were like, listen, we just want to bring an end to one party rule, right? I mean, this just has to stop. I mean, we understand maybe you're trying to do a little bit better than your predecessor, but we're tired of dictators. We're tired of having only one political party. Eventually, Benjedid concedes to this, and elections are called for 1991. Unfortunately, these don't go too well. So what happens is one particular group, the Islamic Salvation Front, which had really started becoming popular in the late 1980s, they do really well in the first round of elections that are held in December of 1991. But the military is really upset about this, right? By this point, the military, in connection with one party rule, had become very prominent within the system, not just politically, but also economically. So they were really fearful that the Islamic Salvation Front would do well in the second round of elections, on the basis of which they canceled them. They canceled the second round and basically banned the Islamic Salvation Front, and this led to civil war. The Algerian Civil War, where more than 160,000 people would be killed between January of 1992 and June of 2002. Many of them civilians who were massacred by various militant Islamist groups, probably the most prominent of which was the Armed Islamic Group. I have to tell you, I read a very thorough book on the Algerian Civil War once. It's one of the most confusing wars I've ever tried to understand, partly because at some point a lot of these militant Islamist groups really become these kind of little mafiosos controlling different bits of territory, on the basis of which they try to achieve some kind of profit. It's like where people have to pay money in order to conduct any kind of economic activity, or protection money in order not to be killed. Very often when we say large numbers of civilians were killed, many of them were killed by bombs in mosques, because probably they weren't being supportive enough of one group, or they were seen as supporting a rival group. So when I'm reading this book, I'm like, they may call themselves Islamist groups, but it seemed to have very little to do with religion. Eventually, at some point, a kind of fatigue sets in, and maybe some militant Islamist groups end up being swallowed up by others who have a smaller number. You have the possibility of actually negotiating some kind of settlement, and the war eventually comes to an end. By 1999, elections are held, and Abdelaziz Bouteflika comes into power. We're going to stop there, but at some point, Algeria also will be participating in this Arab Spring. Bouteflika proves not to be very effective, so it's just kind of, a bit more of the same as far as what we've seen until now. But when the Arab Spring finally comes, it's going to spread into Algeria as well. Morocco actually weathers it pretty well. The government there, the Sultanate, still fairly popular, and seeming to find the right balance in terms of a willingness to relinquish some power, to make some reform, but not enough that they actually undermine their position entirely. So in any event, this is a good place to stop, and please do make sure to do the reading, which focuses on the role of women in the Algerian War of Independence, and a little kind of bit about what their hopes and aspirations were in connection with their involvement, the nature of their involvement, and kind of what they were hoping would follow with independence.